The sun was sinking behind the red cliffs of Arizona, casting long shadows across the land as the wagon train creaked along the dusty trail. The travelers, families, dreamers, and drifters had spent weeks on the move chasing the promise of a better life farther west. Among them rode Clara Evans, a young woman of 22 with wind-burned cheeks and a spirit as stubborn as the mules that pulled their wagons. She had lost her mother to fever on the second week of the journey, yet she carried her memory like a lantern in her heart, quiet, glowing, unbreakable. The air was dry and sharp that evening, and the horizon shimmered with heat ghosts. Clara walked beside the wagon, humming softly, when the first shout tore through the silence. Then came the thunder of hooves. "Raiders!" someone screamed. In an instant, chaos erupted. Men grabbed rifles. Women and children dove for cover. Arrows sliced through the air, striking canvas and wood. Horses reared and screamed. Clara turned just in time to see a wagon burst into flames. Her brother Samuel shouted for her to run, but before she could move, something hit her side. A burning pain that stole her breath. She looked down and saw an arrow buried deep beneath her ribs. The world tilted. Dust filled her throat. Her knees buckled. She tried to call for her brother again, but her voice came out as a rasp. Around her, the battle raged, gunfire, war cries, and the crackle of fire blending into a single roar of madness. Somehow, through sheer instinct, Clara stumbled away from the trail, clutching her wound. She ran until her legs gave out beneath her and the noise faded into the distance. When the sun slipped beneath the mountains, silence claimed the desert. Clara collapsed beside a dry riverbed, her dress soaked with blood. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their cries echoing across the canyon walls. The stars began to bloom overhead, sharp and cold against the black sky. She thought of her mother's voice, soft, steady, telling her to hold on, to keep walking no matter what the world took from her. But now even that memory was fading. The desert felt endless, indifferent. She pressed a trembling hand to the arrow in her side, and the world dimmed at the edges. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought it was a dream, the silhouette of a man stepping out from the shadows. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his long hair bound with leather. The faint gleam of moonlight caught on the knife at his hip and the beads around his neck. His eyes, dark as the canyon behind him, studied her with something between suspicion and sorrow. Clara tried to speak, but no words came. Her body trembled. He knelt beside her, his movements calm and deliberate, like a man who had done this before. When she flinched, he murmured something low and rhythmic in Apache, a voice deep enough to steady even the desert wind. She couldn't understand his words, but the tone was clear. Don't fight. He studied the wound, his brow furrowing. The arrow was poisoned. He could tell by the color of the blood. Swiftly, he broke the shaft near the skin and poured crushed herbs from a small pouch into the wound. She gasped, pain flashing through her. He pressed his palm against her shoulder, holding her still. "Stay," he said in halting English. "Don't leave." Her lashes fluttered. She barely heard him over the pounding of her own heart. He looked down at her face, the pale woman lying broken in the dust, the very image of those who had brought war to his people, and yet something in her eyes made him hesitate. He lifted her into his arms, feeling her blood soak into his shirt. His jaw tightened. He knew what his people would say if they found her. But as the wind carried the faint sound of her breath, he whispered a promise to no one but the stars. "Don't leave me." Then he turned toward the mountains, the dying woman in his arms, and disappeared into the darkness of the canyon where fate waited for them both. The canyon was a world apart from the desert above, hidden, silent and cool beneath towering walls of red stone. The only sound was the steady rush of water trickling from a spring that had carved a shallow pool at its center. It was here that Taji, the Apache warrior, carried Clara Evans, her body limp and burning with fever. He laid her down near the fire pit of his small hideout, a place he'd built years ago when he needed to vanish from both his enemies and his own tribe. Now it became a refuge once more, for a woman he should have left to die. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Blood soaked her torn dress, and her face gleamed with a sickly sheen of sweat. The arrow had been poisoned, and he knew the desert's venom well. It killed slowly, curling through the veins like smoke. He gathered his herbs, ground them with a stone, and mixed them with water from the spring. His movements were sure and practiced, but beneath that calm his heart was storming. What was he doing, saving her? She was one of them, the settlers who had burned Apache land and called his people savages. But when he'd looked into her fading eyes beside the riverbed, something inside him, something human, something long buried, had reached out. Now that same feeling refused to let go. He pressed the salve into her wound and bound it with a strip of soft deerskin. She moaned, shifting beneath his hands, and he whispered to her again in Apache, voice low and steady like a heartbeat. Be strong, white woman. Do not let the night take you. When she stilled, he fed the fire higher and sat beside her, watching the flames dance. Her hair, tangled and dusted with sand, glowed like copper in the light. He remembered how her hand had twitched when he'd lifted her, how even in her weakness she had fought to live. That strength called to him, though he did not yet understand why. As the night deepened, the fever took hold. Clara began to tremble violently, her lips murmuring words he could not understand. She was lost somewhere between the world of the living and the spirits, her voice thin as the desert wind. No. Sam, run! She gasped, her face twisting in pain. Tears slipped down her temples, tracing clean paths through the dust. Taji frowned. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in her voice did. He dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to her forehead.
Quiet now, he said softly.
You are safe, but she wasn't safe. Not truly. If any Apache scouts came this way and found a white woman in his camp, he would be called a traitor. They would kill her and him. Still, as he looked at her, he knew he could not let that happen. When she moaned again, he reached for her hand. It was small, fever-hot, trembling in his calloused grip. He could feel her pulse fluttering beneath the skin, uneven, fragile. You fight, he whispered, his English thick but certain. Do not stop. Her eyes fluttered open for the briefest second. Through the haze, she saw him. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, the fire's glow reflecting in eyes both fierce and full of sorrow. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she felt his thumb brush the back of her hand, steady and human. You saved me, she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded once. You live. For now. Then she slipped back into the fever's grip, her breathing ragged. Taji sat there until the fire burned low, whispering prayers to the spirits for her life. He had not prayed in years. Not since his wife and child had been lost to white soldiers, but tonight the words came unbidden. How desperate. Outside, the coyotes sang again, their cries echoing across the cliffs like ghosts. He pulled his blanket around her, shielding her from the chill, and whispered into the darkness, Don't leave me. When dawn broke over the canyon, its first light found them still there, her hand in his, her chest rising faintly with each breath. He had won the first battle, but both knew the war between their worlds and their hearts was only beginning. The morning sun seeped cautiously into the canyon, spilling gold across jagged rocks and the small fire pit where Clara Evans lay. Her eyes fluttered open, the fever still clinging like a heavy cloak. The world around her was blurred, rocks and shadows, the glint of water in the pool and the towering figure kneeling beside her. At first, fear gripped her chest like iron. She had heard stories of the Apaches, of warriors who took what they wanted and showed no mercy. Her mind raced, conjuring every warning she had ever been told. Don't trust them. They are savages, but then she saw the warrior's eyes. Deep, dark, and steady, they were fixed entirely on her well-being. His hands were gentle as he adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. There was no threat in him, only an urgent concern that pulled at some part of her she had thought long dead. Hope. She tried to speak, but only a croak escaped. Her throat burned with fever and dehydration. Taji handed her a gourd of water, his expression patient, commanding without words. She took it slowly, the cool liquid sliding down her throat like salvation. Good, he murmured in halting English. Strong. Fight. Clara's mind floated between consciousness and fevered visions. She dreamt of her brother Samuel running across the burning plains calling her name. She saw flames licking the wagon train and felt the searing pain of the arrow in her side again. Then a new figure emerged from the smoke. Taji. He shielded her from the fire, lifting her effortlessly, carrying her across the desert toward a sanctuary she could not see. She gasped in the dream, reaching for him, and her fingers brushed against his hand in the waking world. Taji noticed and held her wrist lightly, steadying her. It is not real, he whispered. You are here, safe. Her fever-ridden mind wrestled with disbelief. Safe? How could she be safe with everything she knew? Everything the world had taught her about men like him, yet as her pulse slowed under his careful ministrations, she began to sense a truth deeper than fear. He had saved her life. Taji's presence was overwhelming in its quiet intensity. Every motion he made, pouring water, adjusting her blankets, brushing hair from her forehead, was deliberate, measured, and somehow intimate. Even the gentle tilt of his head as he studied her face made her stomach flutter, though she did not understand why. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words were trapped, dissolved by exhaustion and fever. Hours passed like this, Clara drifting, floating between dream and reality, while Taji stayed steadfast. He had removed the poison from her wound, kept her hydrated, and whispered prayers into the canyon silence. And yet, he had not spoken of the danger looming beyond the canyon walls. The scouts from his own tribe who would not forgive him for harboring a settler. He did not speak because he did not yet know how to. As noon approached, her fever began to break, and Clara blinked into clarity. The man beside her was not just a protector. He was a force of will, a storm of humanity that defied every expectation she had ever held about her enemies. She began to understand the weight of what he had done, saved her when he had every reason not to. For the first time, she whispered his name. Taji. Her voice was thin but laced with gratitude, confusion, and something else she could not name. He turned, meeting her gaze, his eyes soft but guarded. "You live," he said simply. "Do not speak, rest." Even as the sun climbed higher, bringing warmth to the canyon floor, Clara realized something terrifying and exhilarating. She was beginning to trust him, perhaps even to need him. And if the world outside the canyon ever discovered this bond, it could cost them both everything. But for now, in this fragile, fever-drenched morning, life had returned to her. And she knew with a clarity that scared her more than the arrow ever could, that she owed it entirely to the Apache warrior who had carried her through the night. The canyon held its breath as she drifted back to sleep, Taji watching her vigilant and silent, a sentinel between life and death, the known and the unknown. The sun had climbed high above the canyon by the time Clara Evans stirred again. Her fever had broken completely, leaving her weak but alive, and for the first time since the ambush she could move without the pain stabbing through her side. Taji had prepared a simple meal, corn mush and roasted rabbit, and gestured for her to eat. She watched him carefully, noting the grace in his movements, the way he handled the fire and the small knife at his belt. Every motion was precise, controlled, and respectful of life, even as he had taken it when necessary. At first she could only watch, too timid and cautious to speak. Words felt inadequate, dangerous. In her world, Apache warriors were enemies. Here in the hidden canyon, Taji was her lifeline. He noticed her hesitation and offered a small, tentative smile, as if acknowledging her fear without judgment. "Eat," he said in broken English. "Strong, body, strong. Mind." She obeyed, spooning the mush into her mouth, savoring its warmth. Gradually, she began to regain some of her energy, and with energy came curiosity, and the first spark of courage. She wanted to communicate, to bridge the gap between their worlds, yet she had no language for this man who had saved her life. Taji must have understood, because he gestured for her to watch him closely. He picked up a stick and drew simple symbols in the sand, a sun, a water droplet, a flame. Then he pointed to each symbol and said a word in Apache. She, I, to, water, chaos, fire. At first, Clara repeated the sounds haltingly, laughing when she mispronounced them, and he corrected her gently, never raising his voice. "Water," he said. "Water," she repeated, emphasizing the two syllables. It was clumsy, awkward, but it worked. Day after day they built a new language together, not just words, but gestures, glances, and shared moments. A touch on the hand meant reassurance. A raised brow meant warning. A nod, agreement. Slowly, Clara learned to trust him, and Taji, in turn, began to trust her, something he had long stopped doing with anyone outside his tribe. One afternoon, as they sat near the river pool, Clara pointed to a scar on Taji's arm. He tensed briefly, and then, with a quiet sigh, he removed the cloth covering it. A bullet wound, faded but jagged, marred the skin. Clara's eyes widened, not in horror but in sympathy. She took a small cloth and pressed it gently against the scar. "You hurt?" she said softly. Yes, he replied, voice low. Long ago. Fight. And there it was. Trust being built not through grand gestures but through quiet understanding, through vulnerability shared without fear. They were learning each other's world in small pieces, how to survive, how to heal, how to communicate across a chasm of culture, language, and fear. By nightfall, Clara felt a bond forming that neither words nor customs could fully describe. She no longer flinched when he touched her to adjust a blanket or handed her water. She began to anticipate his gestures, to read the subtle movements of his eyes and hands. And Taji, who had once held the canyon walls as his only companions, felt a new awareness stir within him, a protective instinct that went beyond duty, beyond morality into something deeper, more dangerous, the stirrings of attachment, even affection. As the fire crackled and the desert wind whispered through the canyon, Clara tilted her head and watched him, feeling the unspoken truth of their bond. He had saved her life once, and now, through patience, guidance, and understanding, he was teaching her the second lesson of survival, trust, and perhaps eventually love. When night came, she lay down again under the blanket he had made for her, the scent of sage and cedar clinging to him. She met his gaze, and without words, they both acknowledged the fragile bridge that had been built between them. A bridge that could withstand the canyon's shadows, but not yet the world outside. In that silence, trust became their language, stronger than fear, firmer than pain, and as real as the blood that bound their fates together. The canyon, once a sanctuary, suddenly felt fragile. Taji stood atop a jagged outcropping, scanning the horizon with sharp, trained eyes. The desert beyond the canyon wall stretched endless and silent, but he could sense it. The faint crunch of footsteps, the subtle shift in the wind. Something was coming. Clara, now sitting beside the fire, noticed his tension. "What is it?" she asked, her voice timid but alert. He shook his head slightly. "They had looking." "My people." Her stomach tightened. "Your people?" He nodded. The word carried weight. Among the Apaches, hiding a white woman, especially one who had been wounded by settlers, was considered betrayal. If they discovered her, there would be no mercy. Not for her and not for him. His brother, Nantan, a fierce warrior with a grudge against all settlers, would be the first to strike. Taji had survived battles, ambushes, and hunger, but this threatened everything he had built, and perhaps even his life. Hours passed. The sun edged closer to the horizon, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Clara tried to keep her composure, but fear gnawed at her. She had been saved once. She could not afford to be captured now. Taji turned to her, his face grim but calm. "You must leave," he said, his English halting but precise. "If they find you, they kill." Clara shook her head vehemently, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "No, you saved me once. I won't leave you now. I'll fight with you if I must." He studied her, his dark eyes scanning her face for a sign of weakness. Instead, he saw determination, a spark that reminded him of the very first day he had carried her into the canyon. He had thought to protect her, to hide her until the danger passed, but he had not expected her courage to mirror his own. "Very well," he said, voice low. "Then you stay behind me. Always." The first sign of the search party came as a distant echo, the cracking of twigs under boots, the faint whistle of the wind carrying words in Apache. Taji pressed Clara to the ground, shoving a blanket over her head. "Quiet," he commanded, placing his hand on her back as a reassuring anchor. Nantan appeared first, a shadow among the rocks. His gaze was sharp, scanning for signs of intrusion. Behind him, 3 other warriors followed, their spears and bows ready. Taji emerged slowly from behind a boulder, a single figure standing between his brother and the woman who had captured his heart. "Where is she?" Nantan demanded, his voice hard, slicing through the canyon like a knife. "I know you hide a settler. Hand her over, Taji. You betray the tribe with this cowardice." Taji's jaw tightened. His brother had always been stubborn, unyielding, a man who saw the world in absolutes. But Taji had seen death too closely, had carried bodies too heavy, and he would not allow another life to end under his watch. "Mine," he said. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of steel. "You do not take." Nantan laughed, bitter and low. "You choose her over your people? I choose." "Life," Taji said, stepping forward. The standoff was tense. Rocks, Shadows and the wind itself seemed to hold their breath. Nantan lunged first, spear raised. Taji met him with a knife, swift and deadly. Every movement a precise balance of skill and desperation. The clash echoed through the canyon, the world narrowing to the fight between two warriors, brother against brother, tradition against choice. Clara watched, heart pounding. Fear and awe clashed inside her as Taji fought, not for pride, not for honor, but for her. Every swing, every parry was a wordless promise. I will not let you die. By the time the dust settled, Nantan lay wounded, the remaining warriors retreating with curses and threats. Taji knelt beside Clara, his chest heaving from exertion, a deep gash along his arm marring his strength. She reached for him instinctively. You alive? She whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, he said, gripping her hand tightly. For now, you stay. And in that moment, the canyon seemed to exhale, leaving them alone in the fragile quiet of survival, bonded not only by danger but by the unspoken promise that neither would leave the other. The canyon seemed calm after the retreat of Nantan's scouts, but Taji knew better. Silence in the desert was never just silence, it was a warning, a predator's lull before the storm. Clara sat beside the fire, her hands trembling as she tended the herbs and bandages, watching him move with the caution of a man who had danced with death countless times. He had managed to fend off the initial threat, but Nantan would not forgive him. And there was no guarantee the others would stop searching. The thought of losing Clara, the woman who had somehow become the center of his world, gnawed at him like a live coal. As twilight deepened, a movement caught his eye. Shadows slipped between the canyon walls. More of Nantan's men, faster, quieter than before. They return, he said, his voice low, sharp with tension. We must fight again. Clara's heart jumped. Fear surged through her like ice water, but she refused to flee. She had survived once because of him. She would stand with him now, even if it meant risking everything. Taji gave her a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. Stay behind. Do not move. The men descended, their eyes cold, their spears and knives glinting in the firelight. Nantan's voice cut through the air. Taji, hand her over. You dishonor your tribe. Taji stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the advancing warriors. His hand hovered near his knife, every muscle coiled like a spring. She, mine, he said, each word a weapon. You, touch her, you, die. The confrontation exploded into violence. Spears clashed with knives. Shouts echoed against stone walls, and the fire flickered, casting long, moving shadows. Taji fought with a ferocity born of desperation, each strike precise, each movement calculated. He did not fight for glory nor for revenge. He fought to protect her, to keep her alive until the dawn could bring safety. Clara's pulse pounded as she watched. The warrior who had saved her, carried her, healed her, trusted her, was now battling death itself. One of the men lunged for her, a glinting spear aimed at her chest, but Taji moved faster, intercepting the attack with a swipe of his knife that sent the weapon clattering to the rocks. You. Stay, he yelled, his voice filled with a commanding urgency that left no room for doubt. The fight was brutal but swift. Taji's training and experience overwhelmed the attackers. One by one, Nantan's men fell back, injured or outmaneuvered. Finally, Nantan himself lay on the ground, a gash across his shoulder, his breath ragged and angry. Taji, chest heaving, turned to Clara. His shirt was soaked with sweat and streaked with blood, some of it his own, some from the attackers. Alive? He asked, voice hoarse but steady. She nodded, swallowing back tears. You saved me again. Yes, he said, gripping her hand tightly. Again, you. Stay. The danger had passed for now, but the battle had left its mark. Taji's wound throbbed, and Clara could see the strain in his dark eyes, the mixture of exhaustion, pain, and relief. In that moment, she understood something she had felt but not fully acknowledged. Her life, her very survival, depended on him, and his on her trust. As the canyon fell silent once more, broken only by the distant howls of coyotes, Clara moved closer, her trembling hands pressing herbs against his gash. The role of protector and protected had shifted, if only slightly, and she realized that their bond was no longer just survival. It was something deeper, something dangerous and yet undeniable. For the first time, the night seemed almost gentle. The fire's glow illuminated the canyon walls, reflecting in Taji's eyes the same promise he had whispered when he first found her. "Don't leave me." And in that quiet, between the lingering shadows and the steady heartbeat of life, Clara understood that the fight was not over, not for their bodies, not for their hearts, and not for the fragile trust they had built under the harsh Arizona sky. The night had fallen over the canyon like a velvet curtain, and with it came a silence that pressed against Clara Evans's chest. She sat beside the fire, her hands trembling as she pressed herbs against Taji's wound. The pain in his side had been severe during the fight, but the warrior refused to slow down, refused to let exhaustion show. He had fought for her life once, and now, without complaint, she tended to his injuries with the same care he had shown her. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the realization that the man she had feared and admired in equal measure had become something she could not ignore. Each breath he drew, each motion he made, seemed intimately tied to her own survival, not just physically but emotionally. For the first time since the ambush, Clara felt a sense of purpose, to keep him alive just as he had kept her alive. "Sit," he said finally, his voice low and hoarse. He motioned for her to lean against him. She hesitated, but the exhaustion of the day, the fire of adrenaline still burning in her veins, made her obey. Taji shifted slightly, his body curling protectively around her as she pressed the cloth into his gash. The night deepened, and Clara hummed softly, a lullaby her mother had sung during long, lonely nights on the trail. The melody was shaky at first, her voice raw with emotion, but it seemed to calm both of them. Taji's eyes, dark and intense, softened as he watched her, the firelight dancing across the plains of his face. For a moment, the danger beyond the canyon walls, the scorn of his tribe, the wilderness itself, faded. There was only this fragile intimacy, the heat of their shared survival, and the unspoken promise that neither would abandon the other. Clara's fingers worked deftly with the bandages, cleaning the wound and pressing herbs into it. Taji winced but said nothing, allowing her to continue. Each motion was deliberate, careful, and in those small, silent gestures, trust solidified. She realized she was not only saving him, she was learning to rely on him in ways she had never imagined. "Don't leave me," she whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. It was a repetition of the words he had spoken to her when he first found her. But now the weight of the plea came from her own lips. Taji's eyes met hers, and in the shadows of the firelight, she saw vulnerability she had never expected. The warrior who had seemed unflinching, invincible, was human. The corners of his lips tightened, his jaw set, and he whispered back, "Do not leave." Her breath caught. The canyon seemed to hold its own breath. The wind stilled in the shadows, and even the distant howl of a coyote faded into nothing. Time contracted to this single moment. Two people bound by life, by danger, and now by something more tender, more desperate. Hours passed. Clara shifted occasionally, ensuring the bandages were secure, dabbing water on his lips, murmuring encouragements. Taji remained vigilant, scanning the canyon, listening to the wind, every sound beyond the rock walls, yet always returning to her. Through the long night, they exchanged no further words, but the silence was not empty. Every glance, every touch of a hand, every shared breath became a dialogue of its own. Trust was being built in this quiet crucible, and love, tentative, fragile, and dangerous, was threading its way through the spaces between them. As the first hint of dawn began to touch the canyon walls, Clara leaned closer to him, exhausted but unafraid. The fire had burned low, but its warmth lingered. Just as the warmth between them lingered, unspoken yet undeniable, she realized with a mix of fear and wonder that this night, this battle fought with sweat, blood, and whispered words had changed everything. Taji's dark eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. Then with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, they acknowledged it together. Survival had drawn them close. Trust had held them together, and now, through the night, their hearts had begun a fragile, dangerous dance of their own. And though the world beyond the canyon remained unforgiving, neither would face it alone. Dawn crept slowly over the canyon, spilling soft gold across jagged cliffs and the fire-scorched stones. The long night of care, fear, and whispered promises had finally ended. Clara Evans stirred first, her eyes fluttering open to the sight of Taji sitting beside her, watching the sun climb into the sky. His arm was draped over a blanket, a protective barrier between her and the sharp wind that had begun to rise. She moved slowly, Every motion measured and cautious, still weak from her fever and the lingering pain of the arrow wound. Taji noticed her stirring and offered a brief nod, his dark eyes holding concern and something deeper. Something unspoken but undeniable. "You awake," he said, his English halting but precise. Clara swallowed, her lips dry, and managed a faint nod. "You survived," she whispered. "Yes," he replied, voice low, almost hoarse. "You safe." For a moment the canyon seemed to breathe with them. The fire had burned low, embers fading into gray ash. But the warmth of their bond, the trust forged through fear, shared danger, and sleepless care, was stronger than any flame. Clara realized with startling clarity that she no longer wanted to leave. The world outside the canyon might condemn them both, but she could not return to it. Not without him. Taji shifted slightly, the movement careful, deliberate. He drew a small, worn leather pouch from his belt and handed it to her. Inside were tiny stones and carved symbols, tokens he had carried for protection, charms from his tribe. "Keep," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "Safe. You." Clara held the pouch in her hands, feeling the weight of his intent, the sincerity behind the gesture. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she would stay, that she would fight beside him, but words faltered on her lips. Instead, she looked into his eyes, letting her gaze carry the promise her voice could not yet form. Taji understood. Slowly, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, a touch both tender and commanding. I cannot leave," he murmured. "You, not alone." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief and gratitude. Her body, exhausted yet healing, seemed to hum with life again. And in that moment, she realized the depth of the bond that had formed between them, forged in danger, nurtured in care, and sealed with whispered words that neither the desert nor the canyon walls could erase. But reality waited beyond the canyon. Their safety was temporary. The world outside, her people, his tribe, the relentless wilderness was still a threat. Clara understood this, and yet she also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Taji rose, stretching his long frame, and offered his hand to her. Hesitant but resolute, she took it, letting him pull her to her feet. The simple act, filled with strength and trust, symbolized more than survival. It was a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer merely victim and protector. They were allies, partners, and something more delicate, more dangerous, companions bound by life, hope, and the stirrings of love. As they stood together on the canyon floor, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust, Taji spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Promise. You stay, always, with me." Clara's heart ached, a mixture of fear and longing. She nodded, holding his gaze. "I stay," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. The morning sun painted their shadows long and intertwined on the canyon walls. For the first time since the ambush, the world seemed momentarily still, as if granting them a pause before the inevitable challenges that awaited outside. In that stillness, Clara felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real, that together, she and Taji could endure anything. And as the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the faint rustle of distant birds and the promise of another day, both knew that whatever the world demanded of them, they would meet it together. No longer merely survivors. They were bound by trust, by care, and by the unspoken vow that had begun with a single desperate whisper. "Don't leave me." The canyon had served its purpose. Its walls, towering and silent, had sheltered Clara Evans and Taji from both the desert's brutality and the threats of his tribe. But now, with Clara's strength returned and Taji's wounds slowly tending toward healing, the reality of the outside world pressed against them like a rising tide. Clara stood at the edge of the canyon, the wind tugging at her dress and tossing loose strands of hair across her face. Below, the desert stretched endlessly, harsh and unforgiving. Each grain of sand, each jagged rock reminded her of the danger that awaited beyond the sanctuary they had carved together. She glanced at Taji, whose dark eyes scanned the horizon with the same vigilant intensity as always. His hand found hers instinctively, the silent grip a steadying force. "We must go," he said, his English hesitant but clear. "Place trading posts, safe people. No hunt?" Clara nodded, understanding. This was not the canyon she had come to rely upon. This was a threshold. Beyond it lay a world of judgment, suspicion, and danger. but also perhaps a chance to survive together in a more permanent sense. Their journey down the canyon was cautious. Taji moved ahead, clearing the path, checking for ambushes. Clara followed closely, her steps faltering at times but strengthened by his presence. Each movement through the desert was deliberate, measured as if the land itself were testing their resolve. As they neared the borderlands, the landscape shifted. The jagged cliffs gave way to open plains dotted with scrub, and the occasional cluster of trees. In the distance, a small trading post appeared, smoke rising from its chimney like a promise of safety. Clara's heart leapt. This place, modest and remote, could provide shelter, food, and perhaps a temporary refuge from both the wild and the judgments of men and women who might never understand the bond she shared with Taji. Yet she hesitated, the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. "Taji," she said softly, glancing at him, "what if they don't accept us?" He met her gaze, his expression solemn. "We survive first. After, find way." She nodded, trusting him as she had throughout their time in the canyon. Together they approached the post, wary of every movement, every sound. A few figures emerged, traders and settlers, men who paused at the sight of them. Taji's hand remained at Clara's back, a subtle shield and reassurance. The traders studied them, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Taji stepped forward, offering a small nod and gestures that indicated peace, respect, and intent. Clara followed, her presence a calm counterbalance to the silent tension of the moment. The initial hesitation faded, replaced by practical concern. Food, rest, and shelter. Inside the trading post, they found temporary refuge. Clara tended to Taji's lingering wounds while he kept watch outside, ears alert to any sound of pursuit. And though they were safe for now, the knowledge of the world beyond these walls lingered. A constant reminder that their sanctuary was fragile, temporary. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Taji handed Clara a small carved token, a hawk over a flame etched carefully into smooth stone. "If danger, come call fire, bring me." Clara held it tightly, understanding both the promise and the warning. It was a link to the canyon, to the nights they had spent fighting together, trusting together, surviving together. It was a reminder that while the world might not accept their bond, they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever came next. As the stars appeared above the trading post, Clara and Taji stood side by side, gazing into the night. For the first time since the ambush, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet. No battle, no fear, no poison in her blood, no threats from his tribe. Only the desert night, the crackle of fire, and the fragile, enduring promise that had begun in a whispered plea. "Don't leave me." The world outside waited, relentless and harsh. But for now, they had found a fragile haven, a bridge between two worlds, and the knowledge that together, they could face the challenges ahead. The desert stretched endless beyond the trading post, its vast openness both beautiful and merciless. Clara Evans and Taji had survived the ambush, the poisoned arrow, and the threats of his own tribe. Yet now, standing at the edge of the post, they understood that the hardest battles were not behind them. They lay ahead in the harsh, unyielding world beyond. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Clara adjusted the small bundle of herbs and tokens she carried, her fingers brushing the carved hawk that Taji had given her. It was more than a charm. It was a promise, a symbol of their bond, and a reminder of the nights spent in the canyon. The nights when survival depended not just on skill, but on trust, on care, and on the fragile thread of hope that had tied them together. Taji stood beside her, silent but vigilant. His dark eyes swept the horizon, reading the desert as though it were a living thing. Every shift in the wind, every distant movement told him a story of the world beyond the canyon walls. And yet he no longer saw Clara as a liability, nor as someone to protect out of duty alone. She had become something more, his companion, his equal, the heart he had learned to rely on. "You, ready?" he asked, his English careful, deliberate. Clara nodded, "As ready as I'll ever be." Her gaze met his, steady and unwavering. There was fear, yes, but it was tempered by the memory of the nights he had carried her through, of the whispered promises and the quiet, persistent care that had kept her alive. She knew that with him, she could face the unknown. The desert wind lifted, brushing against their faces as they began their journey. Taji led the way, alert and cautious, while Clara followed closely, her steps confident despite her lingering weakness. Each movement was deliberate, each glance between them a silent dialogue. Words were unnecessary. Their trust had evolved beyond language, forged in danger and sealed in quiet moments of intimacy and care. As they walked, Clara felt the weight of the past weeks settle into her bones, the fear, the fever, the uncertainty. But she also felt something new, a strength she had not known she possessed, drawn from Taji's unwavering presence and the bond they shared. She realized that survival was no longer merely physical. It was emotional, a connection that gave her courage to face the world, whatever it might hold. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the trading post behind them seemed a distant memory. The desert stretched ahead, vast and unpredictable, but they moved forward together, their shadows intertwined, the rhythm of their steps in harmony. Clara clutched the hawk token in her hand, a reminder of the whispered words that had begun this journey. "Don't leave me." Taji glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Never leave," he said softly, echoing the promise he had made in the canyon. Clara returned the smile, a mix of gratitude, relief, and the quiet thrill of something unspoken but deeply understood. "I stay," she whispered back, her voice firm, carrying both resolve and the warmth of trust. The wind picked up, rustling the sparse scrub and carrying their whispered words across the desert. In that moment, the vast wilderness, the dangers lurking beyond the horizon, and the uncertainties of life felt manageable. Together they had survived the impossible, and now they would face the world as equals, as companions, bound not only by survival but by a bond forged in the crucible of life and death. As they continued their journey, the canyon disappeared behind them, but the memory of its shelter lingered in their hearts. The nights of fear, the whispered prayers, the shared glances in the dark, all of it had created something stronger than either could have imagined. A connection that would endure, no matter what the world demanded. And so, with the wind at their backs and the promise of tomorrow ahead, Clara Evans and Taji walked into the vast, unforgiving desert together. They were survivors, yes, but more importantly, they were no longer alone. The whispered vow of the canyon had become their truth. "Don't leave me." And in that desert, amidst the endless sand and sky, they would never have to.